Buckle up because we're diving deep today into something you don't see every day. We've got this collection of sources all about moon dust and figuring out how old the moon is. But here's the twist, they're doing it all through a biblical perspective.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. We're talking analyses of an article called Moon Dust, FAQs, about moon dust and how it connects to the biblical timeline. Even a timeline and a rundown of all the important people in this whole interpretation. Plus, we've got some just straight up text on the topic and a study guide focusing on the moon as a biblical timekeeper.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is a unique set of stuff, and the thing that jumps out at you right away is this idea of using religious beliefs to understand something we usually think of scientifically, like dust on the moon. That's what we're going to try to do in this deep dive. We'll dig into what these sources say about why the moon exists, their ideas on how old it is, and what they think moon dust means, all based on the Bible. Oh, and we'll even look at this super interesting and kind of controversial NASA experiment. Get ready for some thought-provoking stuff. So let's start with what these sources say about the moon's creation. They keep coming back to Colossians 1:16. Everything was created through him and for him. And what's fascinating is how they look at that for him part when it comes to the moon.
Right, let's break that down. They're saying that besides the obvious things the moon does for us here on Earth, like tides and maybe keeping our planet stable, its main purpose, according to God, might be something totally different, something built into the moon itself. And they think that could be working like a giant cosmic hourglass, like a way to measure time on a huge scale. So we've got sources suggesting this seemingly simple rock is actually ticking away cosmic time. That's a pretty big reimagining of what the moon is all about.
Exactly. And they have a specific reason for this idea. You see, the moon doesn't really have an atmosphere. So no wind, no rain, nothing to mess with all the stuff on its surface, which means cosmic dust just keeps piling up undisturbed over huge stretches of time.
And they have this quote that really hits this point home. What possibly could be of value to God on the moon? Maybe that is exactly its intrinsic value to God.
Yeah.
It really gets you thinking, doesn't it? I mean, here's this seemingly a basic celestial object, but they're suggesting it has this deep, divinely ordained purpose just by sitting there and collecting dust. Pretty cool, huh?
It is. And this leads right into the idea of moon dust as a way to keep track of time on a cosmic scale. They take that hourglass analogy and run with it. They think the moon is like a massive wall clock, measuring not just seasons and months, but vast amounts of time just by how much dust has settled on it.
Yeah, they make that super clear with this other quote. Not only does the moon mark our seasons and times, it also accurately records the measure of time like a huge hourglass as cosmic dust deposits on its undisturbed surface. And the timeline you sent even says straight up that the moon's purpose is to be a natural hourglass. They aren't shying away from that idea at all.
And they tie it to the Bible, too. They bring up Psalm 72, verses 5 and 7, where it talks about the moon being around until the very end of time. So the idea is that the moon has to last a long, long time to be this cosmic timekeeper. It all fits together.
Okay, but here's where things get really interesting. This whole idea goes against how scientists figure out the age of the moon. They look at how certain elements in moon rocks decay. That's a pretty solid method. And it says the moon is billions of years old. But these sources say the thickness of the dust should be what we look at because unlike the rocks, it hasn't been messed with by all those geological processes.
That's where the big disagreement is. The article says this: when man went to the moon, they had not thought to check the time when they landed, as children learn from the hourglass. Instead, they collected 842 pounds of rocks and asked the rocks the time. They're basically saying scientists missed the point and focused on the wrong evidence. Kind of bold, right?
Totally. So their argument is that instead of studying what the rocks are made of, the astronauts should have been measuring how deep the dust was. Why? Because if the moon is really billions of years old, there should be way more dust than what the Apollo missions found.
And that brings us to the Apollo missions and what those astronauts saw. The sources you sent keep bringing up the fact that the astronauts only saw a pretty thin layer of dust on the surface and the rocks they collected.
Exactly. And that observation is super important for their whole argument. They say this thin layer means the moon must be young, way younger than billions of years. It backs up the timeline of creation in Genesis, according to them. It's one of those aha moments, a tiny detail like the thickness of dust changing how you see the whole picture.
I see what you mean. And the FAQs keep hammering that home, saying the Apollo missions found a surprisingly thin layer of dust, which just wouldn't make sense if the moon was billions of years old, based on how they think dust builds up.
Now get this. They take this idea even further and connect it to a passage from Luke 19:40, where Jesus says that if his disciples stayed quiet, the stones would literally cry out. Wild, right?
So they're saying the moon rocks are kind of like those stones. The fact that there isn't a ton of dust on them, that lack of a thick layer is their way of testifying that Jesus created everything. It's a pretty unique way to look at both the Bible and science.
The article even says, with the Apollo moon landing, even the silent rocks of the moon began to testify that Jesus, the God of the Bible, is the creator. It's a powerful image, isn't it? They're saying the moon itself is offering proof, at least according to how they interpret things.
It's a pretty strong theological argument, and it leads right into this whole thing about the dust detector experiment, the DDE.
Oh yeah, that's where things get a little heated. Apparently, this experiment ran on 4 different Apollo missions over 10 years. And these sources say the guy in charge, Brian O'Brien, found that dust was piling up at a rate of 1 millimeter every 1,000 years, based on something like 30 million data points. Now, if that data was real and showed a young moon, it would be a huge deal for science. That's why these sources are so focused on it.
The catch is, they also claim NASA somehow lost all the data from that experiment and the only moon dust sample they got. So, yeah, that raises some eyebrows.
Absolutely. And what does NASA say? That the DDE was more about testing equipment, not really about measuring dust, but these sources don't buy it. They're like, okay, but why wouldn't you include those findings in the Apollo program reports? Especially since the astronauts were always complaining about moon dust, it was getting in their lungs, messing up their gear, even tasted weird. Why wouldn't that be important information?
They quote this directly in the article. All the data pointed to a consistent dust deposition rate of 1 millimeter per 1,000 years. Yet NASA lost all the data and the one sample of moon dust collected. And the FAQs bring it up too, wondering why NASA is dismissing this experiment when it could tell us so much about the moon's surface. It's like they think NASA's missing something big.
Yeah, the raw text you sent is full of that same skepticism. It straight up asks why NASA would ignore this whole hourglass idea coming from the DDE results. It really highlights that clash between the biblical interpretation and what science says.
So let's zoom out for a second. Think about what a young moon would mean. The sources ask this big question. What if the moon was actually way younger than we think, like less than 10,000 years old? How would that change our understanding of the solar system and life on Earth?
It's a huge question, right? It could rewrite everything we know about history and science. It just goes to show how one interpretation of something like moon dust could completely change our understanding of the universe.
And to wrap it all up, the article suggests that this proof of a young moon is showing up now, right before what they believe is the second coming. They see it as a sign for our modern, tech-focused world. It adds a whole layer of religious meaning to their argument.
All right, let's recap. We've looked at this view that the moon is basically a giant clock made by God, and the way it keeps time is by how much dust builds up. They point to the thin layer of dust found by the Apollo astronauts as evidence that the moon is actually young, not billions of years old. And then there's that whole thing about the dust detector experiment and the missing data, which just adds fuel to the fire. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting how they use specific parts of the Bible, observations from space missions, and questions about this one experiment to make their point. It shows you how you can look at scientific findings through a religious lens and come up with a whole different interpretation.
Absolutely. It really makes you think, doesn't it? If we consider this viewpoint, what other everyday things in space could have a deeper meaning, maybe even be keeping time in a way we don't understand? It gets you thinking about how faith, science, and our own beliefs all play a role in how we see the universe. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been quite a journey.